I'm Dr. Dave Janda. Welcome back to the Insider Insight Show. I am honored to have back with me someone who is a very dear friend, not just to me, but to you and to every person of the world that values freedom and liberty. He's also one of the most despised people by the deep state. Why? Because Harley Schlanger tells you what you need to know, and it's not what the deep state, the criminal international banking syndicate, the New World Order, the City of London, the thugocracy, whatever you want to call them. They're all the same because their focus is all on stripping you of your freedom and liberty. And this is exactly why the deep state despises Harley Schlanger. He tells you, one, what they're up to in behind the curtain in stripping you of your freedoms and liberties. And two, he tells you how to deal with them and how to circumvent their, and it's not an overstatement to say this word, evil goals and objectives. Because their goals and objectives are about oppression. They are about ending the remaining freedoms and liberties you have, and everyone has. And that's not an overstatement. It's a fact. And when people like Harley step forward, they are targeted. And that's one of the first things we're going to talk about today with Harley. Now, a little background on those of you not familiar with Harley. He is the spokesman for LaRouche and has been since 1999. Harley has written extensively on a number of issues, including financial fraud going all the way back to the 1980s and the savings and loan crisis and Michael Milliken and junk bonds. He also covered the effects of banking deregulation and the shift of the United States from a productive manufacturing economy to a speculative casino economy. Harley has interviewed not just on our radio show on a regular basis, but on numerous radio programs, not just around North America, but around the world. And his topics that he covers are the financial fraud and reversing this crisis that has been planned and put into place. One of the big problems is people believe that this is just incompetence. Oh, no. This is willful. And Harley has exposed that willful destruction of our economies, of our world, and of our freedoms. He's lectured widely on these topics across North America and across Europe and, frankly, across the world. His website you can find him on is laroucheorganization.com. It's my honor to welcome back our friend, Harley Schlanger. Harley, welcome back to the Insider Insight Show and the Operation Freedom platform.
Hi, Dave. Always happy to talk with you and your many, many viewers.
So, Harley, let's start. When you were last here and we spoke, you and a number of others, there were 70 people in particular, but 4 quite at the top of the list, of which Harley's on the top of the list, had been notified that you were targeted by I don't know if you want to call it a division, but an operation by the Ukrainian government, an organization called the Center for Countering Disinformation. And it operates under and answers to the Ukraine National Security and Defense Council. Harley, educate our listeners on that organization, why you and 70 other individuals were targeted, and where it stands today.
Okay, well, there are 2 organizations I'll talk about. One you just mentioned, the Center for Combating Disinformation, which is under the Security and Defense Department of Ukraine, but it's funded and directed by U.S. Congress, British government, and NATO. So when we talk about being targeted or put on a Ukrainian blacklist, the Ukrainians are being used as they're being used in the war to target people who are considered enemies by the NATO High Command, by the top officials of the US and UK government. And most of the European governments go along with it, but they're not really anything other than willing puppets. Now, this agency has the responsibility to point out who Ukraine thinks are enemies of Ukraine. And in fact, the head of it on July 14th, when he put out this list of 72 names, originally 78, then 72, What he'd said is these are information terrorists. These are war criminals who should be brought up in a tribunal for war crimes. And on that list were 30 people who had spoken at Schiller Institute conferences. What's our crime? Advocating negotiations, advocating peace, advocating stopping the weapons flow, and moving toward a new financial and security architecture. So that really has very little to do with Ukraine. It has a lot to do with the collapsing Western financial system. Now, also on that list, besides the 30 people tied to the Schiller Institute, and by the way, I'm on that list. Helga Zepp-LaRouche is on that list. She's the second name on that list. Diane Sayre, who's a LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senator in New York against Chuck Schumer, she's on the list. Then people like Scott Ritter, Senator Rand Paul, Tulsi Gabbard, Ray McGovern, the Veteran Intelligence for Professional Sanity, a very important figure in the anti-war movement, a former top CIA official. So all of these people are targeted. Now, what does it mean to be targeted? Well, as I said, the person in charge of this program said these are war criminals. These are information terrorists. But then there's a second list. And this is from an organization called Mirot Vorets. Mirot Vorets. This is the agency that does the hits. This is the agency that put on the top of their list Daria Dugina, the Russian woman who was blown up in a car bomb a week and a half ago. This list also includes very prominently Mrs. LaRouche, me, Ray McGovern, and Tulsi Gabbard. So according to them, we represent a threat to what they're trying to do. And what they say is that we're Putin mouthpieces. We're putting out Putin propaganda. Now, Mrs. LaRouche put out a very interesting statement yesterday. She said, we were talking about these questions long before Putin became a president.
It's true.
And she pointed to Lyndon LaRouche's forecasts in the 80s, where he forecast the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany. He forecast the 9/11 terrorism. He forecast the 2008 banking collapse. This had nothing to do with Putin. No. We have our own intelligence operation, our own, which, by the way, a Reagan official once called the best private intelligence service in the country. It was Norman Bailey, who was a top NSC operative, who was working with Lyndon LaRouche on counterterror in the early 1980s. So we have our own capabilities. And we have been targeted by this network long before anyone ever heard of the Committee to Combat Disinformation. The targeting of LaRouche goes back to a Henry Kissinger letter to William Webster, when Webster was head of the FBI, in 1982, calling on Webster to launch an investigation into LaRouche, his sources of income, his disruptive tactics, and so on. And that became the Get LaRouche Task Force, which ultimately was handed over to William Weld, who at that time was a Justice Department official. And Weld brought in one of his top prosecutors, a man named Robert Mueller, to prosecute LaRouche in 1988. Now, what was LaRouche's crime? At that time, working with Reagan to advocate joint deployment between Russia and the United States of the Strategic Defense Initiative. LaRouche was negotiating with the Russian military as part of the NSC.
And that was under Ronald Reagan's blessing.
Yes.
Yeah,
and Reagan,
that's right.
In March 1983, March 23rd, 1983, Reagan shocked everyone by saying, we want to share this with the Soviet Union. And the next day, the two of the three major U.S. networks back then had to find someone to explain it. Who do they go to? My associates with LaRouche, Paul Gallagher and Uwe Henke, were the ones on Good Morning America and whatever the other one was called, to explain what is the SDI. So we have a long history in this thing. And so the idea that suddenly we're Putin puppets, Putin propagandists, I will say this, the fact is that most people in the United States have no idea what Putin is actually saying and trying to do.
That's right.
And that's not a coincidence, because the same people trying to silence myself and my colleagues are silencing anybody who wishes to discuss these issues. This is what censorship is about. You know, we just saw it again in the Hunter Biden case, where a top FBI official was forced to resign who suppressed the story. This is common. It's typical. But the point is, if we don't move against it, if we don't demand that this agency be shut down, and by the way, let me just repeat this, Dave, it's funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, the same people who were involved in the Maidan coup in February 2014 in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It's funded by MI6, by British intelligence. At the presentation of the list on July 14th, there were State Department officials and military intelligence officials of the United States in the room. Now, Scott Ritter made a very important point. He did a joint interview with Diane Sayre. Scott is on the list, as is Diane. Mm-hmm. What Scott said is that Schumer should be forced to renounce this, because Schumer was the person who fought the hardest to include $1.7 billion of U.S. money to go to Ukraine government operations. This is one of them. Now, Schumer's opponent, Diane Sayre, is on that list. You want to talk about corruption, interference in elections, U.S. funding of a terrorist operation to take out one of Schumer's opponents? And Schumer only has two opponents in that election. Diane is one of the two opponents. So, you know, what Scott Ritter said is that this is one of the biggest scandals, political scandals, he's ever seen. So that's what this targeting is about. And I can tell you, for myself, my associates, my colleagues, we're not going to stop, because what's at stake here is not our reputation. Mm-hmm. It's whether people in the U.S. government will allow this kind of corruption, this kind of manipulation, which is taking us on the course to war. Mm-hmm. Will they continue to allow that to happen? And if anything happens to the people on that list, the blood is on their hands. And we have to make sure that people know that.
You know, Harley, Biden just allocated $3 billion more bucks to Ukraine this week. I think we're well over $65 billion since February 24th, 2022. And his own State Department admits it's a black hole. We're not sure where it's all going. Well, that's great cover, Harley, especially when a bunch of that money is being funneled into these organizations that's targeting people around the world.
Well, and remember, one of the reasons Rand Paul is on this list is that Paul said we need an inspector general to track where the money's going and where the arms are going. Mm-hmm. Now, this is what General Michael Flynn was talking about with the weapons that went through Benghazi and ended up in the hands of Syrian terrorists. It wasn't there was an audit done then, and Flynn reported it, and he was fired for it. Mm-hmm. So Rand Paul tried to bring this up in the Senate. He got 10 other Republicans to vote for it. But you know, the rest of the Republicans and every single Democrat voted against Rand Paul's amendment. And now he's on a target list. So you know, the Congress itself is culpable in this.
Harley, when you look back over the past couple months, what one or two pieces of information that you and the LaRouche organization put forward to the public, the world public, do you believe raise you on that list? There must have been a couple, or at least a couple, pieces of information that really, really got under their craw.
Well, I can tell you something on the bigger picture, because what we've been saying is that this has nothing to do with the freedom and democracy in Ukraine, because Ukraine is not a democracy. It's not a free country. No. Zelensky just signed an order shutting down 70% of the trade unions after shutting down the opposition parties and opposition newspapers. How is that a democracy? How can we honestly say it's Democrats versus autocrats in this situation? And being able to constantly expose the hypocrisy is a part of it. But it goes to this deeper picture of what's behind the Ukraine war, which is that the financial system in the West has been collapsing. And Russia, China, India, Brazil, a number of other countries are looking into a potential to protect themselves from both the collapse of the dollar system, but also the insistence of the NATO countries that they give up their sovereignty to a world government, to the so-called Great Reset. Now, this is the issue that no one will talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But this is where the Russians, as a sovereign nation with a good military, is saying, we're not going to be bullied. Interestingly now, that refrain is being heard by U.S. Officials everywhere. Blinken recently was in South Africa and was telling the South African foreign minister, you've got to stop giving support to Russia. And she said, let me remind you, South Africa is a sovereign nation, and we will not be bullied. Now, Blinken's response was not reported. I'm sure he was choking on his pride. But you have this repeated day by day by day. Governments, look, the Solomon Islands just said to the United States,
right.
Don't send your ships here.
Right.
We don't want to be pulled into a war with China on your behalf. So what I think the reason we were targeted, and again, this has nothing to do with Ukraine. I mean, we've reported honestly on Ukraine, as has Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter, Danny Davis, and a number of ex-military people who were reporting that everything we're told about Russia losing, that Ukraine being so powerful is a bunch of bunk. But that's not unique to us. Our uniqueness is by showing that this is part of a continued policy of what you might call an Anglo-American imperial policy of denying sovereignty to nations, of pushing policies that benefit the few billionaires, those with the military-industrial complex, raw material companies, cartels, and the financial and banking cartels. They're the beneficiaries of what NATO and the U.S. is doing to stampede any country that is looking to get out of this unipolar system, to stampede them into staying in either by coup, war, assassination, or so on. So by tying it together, and this is the unique thing about Lyndon LaRouche, that he always argued that you can't look at the strategic situation separate from the economy. And he also said you can never underestimate the insanity of the people who are trying to keep their power. That they are operating from a standpoint that they could win a limited nuclear war if they had to. And so they're willing to go to the brink. Now, I think this is why it's so dangerous. And at this point, the reason we're coming under a targeted focus is that LaRouche's ideas are appearing everywhere. Just today, the Russian language BRICS research organization, and BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's sort of a core of a new financial system. They put out our organization's call for a new Bretton Woods, that putting the current financial system into bankruptcy, breaking with the funny money policies of the central banks, and instead going to a hard currency based on physical goods production. That was in a publication of an institution which has more people in terms of the numbers than the G7. So here we're influencing a significant section of the world's population. And these are countries that have been bullied for many, many years. And they're now seeing in Putin, in China, maybe now is the time they can stand up for their own people's dignity, for their own sovereignty. And that's the threat. Now, whether Biden knows it or not, that's what's driving the U.S. policy. And that's what was driving the U.S. policy under Bush Jr. and under Barack Obama, because all of this goes back to Bush Jr. and Barack Obama. There was some opposition to this with Trump, but there were too many of the swamp creatures left in the administration, so Trump was not able to deal with it effectively. And now we see it back with this figurehead Biden. And the fact that we're targeted is not a surprise to me, because our organization has been targeted for 40 years.
And we saw this Anglo American access, Harley, that you speak about through Clinton, obviously, through old man Bush as well. And Harley is speaking about the Anglo-American access. What's behind that, and tell me if I'm wrong, is the bank, what I call the banksters, the Criminal International Banking Syndicate. And they just had their big powwow in a beautiful place, the Tetons at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Powell, said, well, Americans are going to have to feel pain. As if they're not feeling pain with $5 gas, with clothing prices through the roof, foodstuff prices through the roof. You name the entity, building entity, any kind of consumer, anything through the roof. And he's saying, yeah, you think you felt pain so far. Just wait. Harley, give us your take on what happened at Jackson Hole and what's happening around the world with these banksters, as I call them.
Well, let's go back a couple of years when this actually took off. These operations have been in place for many, many years, going back to Walt Wriston in the 1980s. He wrote a book called Twilight of Sovereignty. Goes back to David Rockefeller, to J.P. Morgan Chase, to the so-called Rothschild interests in Europe. They've been looking for a means of getting rid of the problem of sovereign nation states, which seem to think that they should act for their people first as opposed to for the banking cartels. Now, this came to a head in an interesting way in the August 2019 Jackson Hole meeting, because at that one, Larry Fink from BlackRock teamed up with Mark Carney, who at the time was the governor of the Bank of England. Mm-hmm. And what they talked about was a regime change in global finance. They used that term, regime change. Mm-hmm. And what they said is that this is what the Great Reset is. We need to take power away from national governments to make fiscal policy, spending policy. Because they said that's where the problem is. Because those governments will tend to do what they think their people want, as opposed to what the banks need. Now, the reality is that that was the point at which the international financing operations protecting against chain reaction default broke down. The so-called repurchase market, the repo market, the overnight lending market, where you could go borrow money for 24 hours, give some kind of financial instrument to get the money so that you could roll over your debt again and then pay it back the next day. Banks stopped doing that because they were afraid of a default. So the Fed stepped in. And starting in September, in fact, September 17th, 2019, 1 month after the Jackson Hole meeting, the Fed went into quantitative easing on steroids. $13 trillion in that fourth quarter of 2019. Another 10 or so trillion in the first quarter of 2020. And they haven't stopped since then. Now, the problem they have is they have an inability to pay the debt because the corporations that are borrowing the debt and issuing the bonds are insolvent. They're not making enough money to pay the interest on these bonds. So the banks step in with free cash from the Federal Reserve. But this is why we have inflation. The idea that Putin caused the inflation is bunk. The inflation started in 2020 and 2021, long before anyone heard about Ukraine. And this is something LaRouche wrote about in something called the triple curve function, where he talked about as financial aggregates go up, that is debt financing, monetary aggregates have to go up to be able to keep them
to service the debt.
Yeah. But that means there's no money left over for investment in physical production. And so the triple curve is two curves going up at a hyperbolic rate and the productive curve collapsing.
Yep.
Now, this is simple.
It is.
It's something that almost anybody could understand except someone with a Harvard degree or somebody with a top position in finance in the major international banks. So why is it that we have to have pain because these idiots have carried out a policy which is unsustainable?
Right.
Now, it's not just Jerome Powell who said this at Jackson Hole just on Friday, where he said, we're not only going to need pain, but if it doesn't work, if it doesn't stop inflation, we'll go to the Volcker policies. Paul Volcker, when he was the Federal Reserve Chairman, was working with the Trilateral Commission in something called the Project for Controlled Disintegration. You can look this up. It may still be on the internet somewhere, but controlled disintegration of the world economy. So this was their intention, to create a situation where they could grab all the physical assets and leave everyone else with a little bit of revenue from trading worthless pieces of paper. Now, not only is Powell saying this, the Belgium Prime Minister yesterday said, well, we have to be transparent with our policies, and we have to tell you the coming months will be difficult. The coming winters will be difficult. The next 5 to 10 winters will be difficult. He's talking about 5 to 10 years of unaffordable prices for electricity and heat in Europe. Macron, the French president who comes from a banking background, said the age of abundance has ended. And he said it's going to end because the endless cash flow must end. Now, what does it mean if they actually keep raising interest rates and stop servicing the debt? There'll be a chain reaction default, and it will hit medium-sized corporations, large corporations. It will hit state and local governments, and at a situation in which there are shortages of everything, not because of the breakdown of the supply chain, but because we've shut down our physical production. That's what the supply chain is all about. People focus on what's going on with the ports and the rail terminals and so on. Well, they're all in terrible shape.
Right. But you got to produce it to ship it.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're finding you can't even get workers now who will work in these companies that will produce something. Now, what's the difference with Russia? Russia has an economy based on physical production. They have huge agricultural surpluses right now. They have raw materials, strategic metals, they have timber, they have gold, and they have very little debt. And they have oil and gas. What about China? You know, with all the talk about China's problems, China has replaced the exports they've lost to Europe with exports to developing sector countries. Now, this is supposedly the debt trap. Well, actually, China is writing down a lot of this debt. The Chinese aren't stupid. They've studied what the International Monetary Fund did to make basket cases out of the so-called developing sector countries. That's why the Nigerians, the Brazilians, the Algerians, the Indonesians are thumbing their nose at Blinken and at the U.S. policymakers. You know, I've been invited recently to do regular broadcasts on television in Algeria, in Pakistan, in Lebanon, in a number of countries who have decided they can't trust the narratives coming from Western figures. So this is why we're targeted. And it really has to do with what Putin said in a speech in Moscow about a week and a half ago. He said, the world is in a transition period right now. And he said, we don't want to destroy the Western countries. We have a lot that we could do in collaboration. But they're out to destroy us, and we're not going to let them do it. And I think this is the issue in Ukraine. And the Western governments are willing to send weapons into Ukraine to fight to the last Ukrainian to weaken Russia. And I think at a certain point, the Ukrainians are going to figure this out. And maybe there'll be a coup or something in Ukraine, who knows? But this is an unstable situation. It's moving quickly toward where an accident could trigger thermonuclear exchange. And that's why this is an absolute moment where it's time for the American people not just to watch, not just to curse the idiocy or the evil of our governments, but to start mobilizing. You know, in Germany, starting this week, there are going to be farm tractorcades virtually every weekend. A week ago, there were 600 tractors that went through Bonn. The Dutch farmers are shutting down traffic in the cities. In Italy, the taxi drivers and truckers are going to go on strike. So in England, the third largest port is shut down. And it's because the government has not given them a wage increase in 5 years. Inflation this year in the United Kingdom is projected to be at 18%, And that's not even counting the fuel and electricity costs. Here in Germany, the idiot who's the economics minister, who's a Green Party member, Habeck, has said that in order to cover the increased cost to government for providing electricity, every household will be taxed $2,000 between October and March on top of the higher costs of utilities. And then someone said to him, well, how are you going to be able to help offset some of that? And he said, well, maybe we'll use some of the $2,000 to give people a trickle back. Now, this is where you see these governments have lost any touch with reality. And I think it's the same thing in the United States, except in the United States, the people in charge have successfully figured out, at least up till now, how to use identity politics to divide people up who should be working together. And I think this is what's the greatest fear about a potential Trump campaign is not Trump himself, but that people see him as a possible vehicle where people who have similar beefs can join together. The farmers, for example, who are being shut down. Dave, I don't know if since we haven't talked for a while, in Ukraine, one of the things that Zelensky did is push through a land reform, which is taking land away, the most
fertile
best land in the world, taking it away from family farmers and selling it off to BlackRock, Vanguard, Cargill, Archer Daniels, Midland, and these grain cartel companies, turning the Ukrainian people into serfs. This is going back to feudalism. And that's what the World Economic Forum is about. That's what Schwab is about. But I wouldn't focus on Schwab. Before there was Schwab, there was David Rockefeller and Walt Wriston.
And Kissinger.
And Kissinger, exactly. And Brzezinski. And Madeleine Albright. There's a continuity of these figures going back to the post-Kennedy assassination period. And we've got to get America back to what it was, at least what it was during the 50s and early 60s.
So, Harley, let's address our listeners who say, okay, I've had it, and I'm not taking it anymore. But I need to find a way to channel my energies and my time and my efforts so that it's effective. So what should each and every one of our listeners do in subverting these freedom-stripping agenda and plans of the syndicate?
Well, I think the first thing is to take the time to make sure you know what you're talking about. It's not enough just to have a white-hot anger against insanity. That's at least proof that you're sane. But then once you discover you're sane, how do you do something about it? I'll give you just one example of something a couple of my colleagues did. They went to a town meeting of New York Senator Gillibrand, and they just asked her, what are you going to do about the fact that your co-senator from New York, Schumer, is funding terrorists in Ukraine who are targeting American citizens, including the Senate candidate in New York, Diane Sare. And the audience, erupted. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And Gillibrand pretended she knew nothing about this and said, well, I'll get my aide on it. So the aide came over to talk to our organizers, and people gathered around and said, what are you going to do? And the aide was literally shaking, because what they're accustomed to is people asking questions and walking away angry. We have solutions. The solutions include shutting down the funding to Ukraine. We can't afford anything in the United States. How can we afford $60 billion to give neo-Nazis weapons to go out and kill people? But beyond that, the question then, this is why you have to take it to this economic question. LaRouche drafted something, I think in about 2009, called his 4 Laws, which are a composite of how the American system was set up by the Founding Fathers, advanced by Abraham Lincoln, what Roosevelt intended with the post-war Bretton Woods system, which was sabotaged by the British. But what he put forward are 4 simple things. you have a separation in banking between commercial banks and investment banks.
Mm-hmm.
For many years, this was called the Glass-Steagall Bill.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was voted out by Democrats and Republicans, signed by Bill Clinton in 1999, and that's what led to all the blowouts, starting with the dot-com crisis and so on in the early 2000s. What it meant is that by repealing it, commercial banks could start using their customers' deposits and accounts to put it into the pool of speculation money. And they did it knowing that they might lose the money of their depositors,
Mm-hmm.
but they would be bailed out.
They would be backstopped. Yeah.
Yeah. And they were
Mm-hmm.
after 2008.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what LaRouche said in 2008 is, no, put the investment bankers through bankruptcy. Let them eat their losses, and we'll then have to create some money to keep the people who honestly invested with them, give them something to stay in their homes and businesses and so on, but that you don't allow the investment banks and the swindlers and the hedge funds to continue.
Mm-hmm.
We did the opposite.
Yep.
We threw 6 to 8 million families out of their homes and spent $23 trillion bailing out the banks. So that's the first one, Glass-Steagall, bank separation, and move away from privatization and so on. Now, secondly, a credit system. And this is where people get confused because they think, oh, well, if the government makes credit available, that's inflationary. No, if a government generates credit that's directed through the banking system into physical production, which is determined by the bankers who get the credit. It's not determined by the government where it goes. But if you do that, that was called the Hamiltonian credit system. That's how we built our nation in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Funded manufacturing, entrepreneurs, inventors, scientists, research and development to become the great power we were, industrial, agricultural power. So a Hamiltonian credit system as opposed to a funny money private Federal Reserve System. Now, the third part is fund infrastructure. And again, you get people who say, well, that's wasted money. If you fund the right kind of infrastructure that improves the platforms of connectivity, transportation, and so on, it cheapens the cost of everything that's produced.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bonus to the economy. Again, this is what Hamilton proposed. This is what Lincoln did with the transcontinental rail system. This is what we did in the 30s with the TVA and Grand Coulee Dam and such projects. They more than pay for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fourth one is have special investment funds going into the frontiers of science and technology. In this case, nuclear fusion investment, particle plasma physics, space exploration, and so on, where you get a significant return for everything the government spends. Those four laws would revive the United States in an instant because we still have people who believe in the system. They know that the government and the administration is corrupt, but that the Constitution and the American system still could work. And so our job is to revive that in the way people think. Now, then what we have to do is hold politicians accountable for that.
Mm-hmm.
And we're almost at the midterms. I don't see a lot of promising people who are running. I see people who are running for good reasons to try and knock out some of the bad policies.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things we can do is defeat the green policy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This Biden anti-inflation bill is nothing but a boondoggle for crazy environmental schemes, which is why we have energy shortages now and high costs. So we have specific programs. We also have programs internationally that would work. So if people want to get these programs, get these ideas, they can send me an email. I'll give you my email address later in the program, but I'll put you in touch with our production team that will get you the material that you need so that you can speak with authority. And many people have the authority of knowing that what we have is corruption, a corrupt cabal running our Justice Department, for example. If you look at what we just saw with this Mar-a-Lago raid, it proves what LaRouche always said, that we have an absolute rot of corruption in the permanent bureaucracy. That should have been rooted out by Trump. It wasn't. But if we get a chance to do it again, we have to root it out. And those are the things that can be done. It's not a simple process, but there's one other point, Dave, I just want to make.
Mm-hmm.
We have allies all over the world. Our allies are not the British government or the French government or the German government. Those are patsies.
Right.
Those are subservients. We have potential allies in virtually every country, including in Germany. People in Germany who are sickened by seeing the German government sending arms to people who are Nazis. Now, just imagine this. After what Germany went through with the denazification, we now have a so-called left centrist government providing weapons to the Bandera Brigade, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalism, people who do Heil Hitler salutes, people who march behind swastikas, who are committed to ethnic cleansing, whose organizations in the 40s were working directly with the Nazi SS to carry out pogroms against Jews, Romanians, Hungarians, and Poles. That's who is running these counter disinformation teams. And I know you and I talked about this before. That's who Nina Jankowicz worked with.
Mm-hmm.
She was deployed in Ukraine. And fortunately, we stopped, at least initially, the Disinformation Center in the U.S. government, but they're trying to pull it in through Homeland Security and other ways.
So, Harley, educate our listeners in how they can follow you, how they can get more information, because as you said, if you just take those 4 pillars, which we have ample more information on, and they first run it through their family, and then they go to their neighbors, and then they go to their coworkers, and then they go to those who supposedly are representing them in state and local and federal. Harley, it would be a tsunami.
Yeah.
A tsunami of freedom. Because I've always said, Harley, and people say, oh, come on, Dave. Nope, I've always said, when folks in the political world get wind that the public is wise to an issue or an approach, and they are seen as being ignorant to that approach or trying to block that approach that will lead to a better future, they got 2 choices. They can either try to fight it,
Yeah.
and we got the numbers, and lose, or they tell all the lobbyists that have put money in their pockets to do something different, and they're going to say, you know what, I'd like to, but sorry. Because you know what? My electorate is wise to this, and they're all over me, and you know what? I'm not going to sit in this big leather chair without without their help. So you know what?
Do you remember what Obama said when he came in after the 2008 blowout? He had a meeting with the top bankers, and he said, "I'm all that's standing between you and the pitchforks."
Yep.
And what he did is he gave them trillions of dollars and then went out and lied like crazy to the population. It was still gullible enough at that time to go along with it. And what was the problem? You had, on the so-called left, Occupy Wall Street. On the so-called right, you had the Tea Party. They had so much in common.
They did.
The opposition to bailouts, the opposition to Obamacare. But they worked with the old left-right profiles.
That's exactly
This is
it.
communism. This is fascism. I was just on a program earlier. Someone asked me, what do I think about Biden saying that we have, what did he say, semi-fascism or something like that in the United States?
Right.
Yeah. And I just said, here's a guy who's giving $60 billion to openly avowed neo-Nazis.
Right.
Lecturing the American people
about semi-fascism
policy.
Yeah. Right.
So you take some of these anomalies, some of these ironies, and you need something like that to shock, especially family members, because so many family members get together and they say, I don't want to hear it. This is conspiracy theory. They wouldn't know a conspiracy theory if it hit them in the head. What we're dealing with is censorship. We're dealing with gag operations. We're dealing with a chill of First Amendment rights. And this is what I see when I look at this question of what's being thrown at me. What's their goal? To debate me? To counter me? No, it's to silence me.
It's to silence you.
Yeah.
It's to censor, control, and shut you up.
And what happens if people won't be silenced?
That's right.
And you take a risk with that because we have, look, the FBI, for example, in Russiagate, was caught lying over and over and over, but they never were brought to account for that.
No.
And for that, I blame the people around Trump who didn't give him the full support that he needed to drive a bulldozer through the permanent bureaucracy. And we can't sit back and say, well, let's wait for Trump again.
No.
He'll take care of it.
Right.
We have to do it.
That's
it's
right.
up to the people.
That's right.
And so I would say, educate yourself, think these things through. We have a rich tradition of rebellion, not just angry populism, but serious thinking about how to bring back the traditions and the principles of our nation. And that's what's needed right now. So if people want to be in touch with me, I always answer emails. But first thing I'll do is give people a link to my daily update. I do a 10 to 12 minute update 5 days a week. It's on the LaRoucheOrganization.com. But if you send an email to me, I'll send you the link. It's harleysch@gmail.com. And I always answer your listeners.
You do, Harley. Harley, I'd like to thank you for everything you have done, are doing, and will do. Harley, your daily presentations are brilliant. They are insightful and they are inspiring. And it's some of the best time anyone will spend in a 24-hour time period getting your podcasts, because they truly are, they really, really focus on every person's freedom and liberty. And I'd like to thank you, Harley, because you know what? There, as we've mentioned today, there is tremendous pressure on you and many others to just shut the hell up and to just go the hell away. And frankly, that's the easier route, much easier route. And I want to thank you, Harley, for your perseverance, dedication, and sacrifice on behalf of every person of the world's freedom and liberty. Because you speaking and holding the syndicate's feet to the fire of freedom and liberty helps every person today and tomorrow and for many years and many decades and many hundreds of years to come. I thank you, Harley, for everything you have done, are doing, and will do. And I thank you folks for joining us today. Until next time, Dave Janda signing off. Dream big and dare to fail. Thanks for your time today.